All right, so welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to try to understand this idea of monitoring spirits.
Interesting topic, right?
Definitely. You sent me this YouTube video. It's called YT Woman Warns Black Women to Watch Out for the Evil YTW Monitoring Spirit in Sheridan Bay at Cavendish.
That's the one.
Okay, and it's from the channel Queen Penguins Uganda.
Yep,
It's a reaction video
it is.
to a story about a black woman who says she felt like she was being stared at by these white women when she was at having breakfast at Tiffany's.
Right.
So we're going to use this video to kind of explore this whole idea of monitoring spirits and kind
Yeah.
of look into the social dynamics that are at play in these videos.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how this term monitoring spirits brings this like almost supernatural element to
Right.
what's actually like a very real experience for a lot of Black people.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So it starts with this story about a black woman who's having breakfast at Tiffany's.
Yeah.
And she's talking about how she just feels like all these white women are just staring at her
Right.
intensely.
Right, very intensely. And then the YouTuber, Gracie, she kind of connects that experience to this idea of monitoring spirits.
Yeah.
And I think for her, it's really about this feeling of being not just watched, but like judged and scrutinized in spaces that are sort of traditionally seen as white spaces.
Exactly. And she really emphasizes that there's like an intentionality behind it. She uses the term gazula, which is, I guess, from her language.
Yeah, it's a term from her language, and it implies that there's almost this negative force behind the staring, like they're almost trying to evilize you.
Whoa.
So it's not like a neutral gaze,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
very loaded. It makes you think about how our different cultural backgrounds really can shape even how we understand something as, seemingly simple as staring.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not just like someone glancing at you. It's like there's this whole other layer of like a power dynamic going on.
Absolutely.
And she kind of takes it back even further historically. She connects this idea of monitoring spirits back to the history of slavery in America.
Yeah, yeah. She talks about how the word officer, like a police officer, actually comes from the word overseer, which is what they called the people who, control the slaves on the plantations.
Right.
So she's kind of connecting, a modern figure of authority back to that really dark period in American history, and it's a powerful connection she's making.
Yeah. And then she also brings up neighborhood watch signs, like
Mm.
in wealthier, mostly white neighborhoods.
Right.
And how it's like that same energy, like that watchful, suspicious energy that's being directed at like anyone who's considered an outsider in that space.
Totally. And I think that actually links back to the history of segregation in America, because you have these places like Tiffany's, these high-end luxury stores that historically have really been associated with whiteness.
Hmm.
So when you have Black people entering those spaces, it can be seen as disruptive. Like they're not supposed to be there according to, that old way of thinking.
Yeah. And Gracie even talks about how she sees this idea of white women almost being co-opted by white men to keep this whole system of oppression going.
Yeah.
She mentions how historically white women could primarily own slaves as property.
Right.
And so in a way, they had a stake in that system too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes you wonder about like how much of this monitoring, is coming from a place of like actual malice versus like some white women just trying to like belong in a system that they see as benefiting them, even though it obviously comes at a cost to other people.
Yeah, it's such a complicated issue. She even compares this kind of staring to the movie Get Out.
Oh, interesting.
Okay? You remember in Get Out where you have that white woman who is inhabiting a black woman's body,
Right.
and she's acting in like ways that we don't usually see black women acting.
Mm-hmm.
And Gracie's point is that like the same action,
Mm-hmm.
can be perceived so differently based on who's doing it. It's all about I guess what they call implicit bias, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it really brings up that whole idea of like how much of what we're seeing is actually like being filtered through these unconscious judgments that we have. We don't even realize we're doing it sometimes.
It's wild. Okay, so this is where it gets even like more layered.
Okay.
She talks about whiteness as a concept of lack.
Ooh, that's a good one. I'm curious to hear your take on that. What do you think she means by that?
I think what she's getting at is that like whiteness as an idea, as a social construct, gets its meaning from what it's not rather than from what it is. So it's not about having any inherent qualities. It's about drawing a line and saying, okay, this is what we are and this is what we are not.
It's defined by exclusion.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So to like maintain this idea of white superiority, there has to be this constant vigilance.
Hmm.
There's this need to keep the others in check.
So that's where the monitoring spirits come in.
Right,
Right.
right. It's not just about individual prejudice. It's like there's this whole societal structure that's
Yeah.
constantly reinforcing those boundaries.
Yeah, yeah. And it's so deep-seated, you know? Like it's almost invisible sometimes.
It's scary to think about. Like, it's not enough to just be quote unquote not racist. You know,
Right.
even well-intentioned white people might be supporting these really harmful systems without even realizing it, just by the way they act, the things they say, you know.
Absolutely. And that's why she's talking about being conscious of those subtle actions, those little biases, those microaggressions. It's about recognizing how those things contribute to the overall problem.
So it's about like actively doing something about it instead of just ignoring it.
Exactly.
Which is what she's calling for, you know. She wants people to actually be aware and accountable, to actually confront those microaggressions instead of just dismissing them.
It's a big challenge, but an important one.
Totally. And there's so much more to unpack here. She even goes on to talk about how, like, even in Africa and in different tourist spots around the world, she's seen how Black women are treated differently.
Right.
And, like, those experiences have shown her that these dynamics, you know, they can be really, really complex. There are these assumptions about race and belonging that exist even within, you know, communities of color.
Yeah, it's definitely not as simple as black and white, so to speak. It really makes you think about how these monitoring spirits, they can show up in all these different ways, you know, in all these different cultures and contexts.
Yeah, and that's what makes this so interesting to think about. Like,
Yeah.
where else does this play out in our lives? Where else do these dynamics exist?
It's a question we all have to grapple with, really. And it actually makes me think about this other concept called white fragility. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I think so. It's like when white people get defensive when you talk about race, right?
Exactly. Even if they have good intentions, it can be really hard for some white people to like hear about issues of race and privilege without feeling attacked or getting defensive.
And that just shuts down the conversation, right?
Yeah, it creates a barrier to actually having honest and productive conversations. And I think this video, like this whole idea of monitoring spirits, it's really pushing people to get past that fragility, to really look inward and think about their own role in all of this.
It's like she's saying, don't just tell me you're not racist. Show me, you know?
Yeah, it's about moving beyond just being not racist to actually doing the work of being anti-racist.
That's a whole other level, right?
It is. It means constantly learning, reflecting on yourself, and really being willing to face some uncomfortable truths about yourself and, you know, the systems that you're a part of.
It's a lot to ask, but I think it's necessary.
It is.
And clearly it's resonating with people. I mean, this video went viral for a reason, right?
It did.
Right.
I think people are really hungry for these conversations. People want to talk about race and privilege and how it all plays out in our lives.
Yeah, yeah. And this idea of monitoring spirits is like such a powerful way to frame that whole conversation.
I agree. And it also shows how powerful, you know, online platforms can be for like amplifying these marginalized voices and bringing attention to these really important issues that often get ignored in like mainstream discussions.
Absolutely. And this is just the beginning. There's so much more to talk about. In part 2, we're going to dive into one of her most striking points, her focus on this whole concept of access.
Yeah.
She argues that as Black people gain success and start entering those spaces, you know, like the Tiffany's breakfast, it can trigger a reaction in some white people.
And that reaction can range from, you know, just discomfort to full-blown resentment, which raises all these questions about like perceived ownership and entitlement and who gets access to what.
It's really about what it means to belong
Yeah.
and how those shifting social dynamics can really challenge these deep-seated beliefs. So be sure to join us for part 2 of this deep dive where we'll unpack all of that and more. Okay, so welcome back to the deep dive. Picking up where we left off, we're looking at this whole idea of monitoring spirits and, you know, how that plays out in society. In part 1, we talked about this really interesting point that the YouTuber Gracie made about this whole concept of access.
Right, right. She argues that when Black people start, you know, achieving success and they start entering spaces that have traditionally been associated with white people, you know, like that Tiffany's breakfast we talked about, that it can trigger this this wave of discomfort and even resentment from some white people.
Yeah, and it's almost like these spaces are seen as like exclusive. Like
Yeah.
their value goes down if other people are allowed in.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's that whole zero-sum mentality.
Right.
where, if somebody else is winning, then it must mean that they are losing.
And she ties this back to the idea of monitoring spirits.
Mm.
Those stares, the microaggressions, those become like a way to reinforce that dominance. It's like, you don't belong here.
It's almost like, yeah, it speaks to this almost like ownership over these spaces,
Right.
this belief that certain opportunities, they should just be for white people. And it's tough to confront that.
Yeah.
But I mean, we have to if we really want to understand what's at the root of this problem,
And she really doesn't shy away from those hard truths. Even this concept of good white people.
Yeah.
She even questions that. She's suggesting that even without intending to be racist, white people can still be feeding into those power dynamics just through their biases and their actions.
And I think that's a crucial point. We spend so much time talking about overt racism, but sometimes it's those unconscious biases.
Right.
The
Yeah.
seemingly harmless things that people do, those are actually the most insidious.
Yeah, because you don't even realize it's happening half the time.
Exactly.
And it really puts the responsibility on each of us to, take a look at ourselves, examine our own biases, even when it's uncomfortable.
Oh, for sure.
Because we're all part of this system, whether we like it or not.
It reminds me of that. It reminds me of that idea of what is it? White fragility.
Oh, yeah.
It's like that defensiveness that some white people experience when they're confronted with these issues of race and privilege. It makes it so hard to have these real conversations.
And I think that ties in perfectly with what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
It's this video, this whole idea of monitoring spirits. It's really pushing people to move past that, to engage in some real self-reflection. And it's about more than just being not racist. It's about actively working to be anti-racist.
Exactly.
And that requires more, right?
It does. It means constantly educating yourself. It means listening to other people's experiences. And it means being willing to challenge those deep assumptions that you have.
It's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like that's what she's urging people to do.
She is. She wants viewers to really become aware of their actions, to call out those microaggressions when they see them, to use their voices,
And to remember that, if you're not saying anything,
right,
you're part of the problem.
Silence equals complicity, yeah. We're not going to be able to break down these systems if we're not actively working to dismantle them.
It's a big task.
Yeah.
And she also connects this back to that idea we talked about before about whiteness as a concept of lack.
Right. Which is, it's still mind-blowing to me every time I think about it.
It's a powerful idea for sure.
It is. Think about it this way. If your identity is built on, what you're not, rather than what you are, then there's this constant need to reinforce those boundaries.
So instead of, celebrating their own unique qualities,
right,
whiteness relies on exclusion. It relies on keeping others out.
Yeah, and that need to protect that special status.
Right.
That fuels the monitoring spirit.
So it creates that constant vigilance. You're always on guard. Any advancement by other people is seen as a threat.
Exactly.
Which explains why, when Black people achieve success and enter those spaces, there could be that resentment.
It disrupts that whole sense of entitlement, right?
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
Yeah.
But I think understanding these psychological dynamics, it's really important if we want to create actual change.
I agree. I think she does a really good job of weaving together, history and social psychology and personal stories, even pop culture references.
Yeah, like that Get Out comparison.
Oh, yeah. That was perfect.
Really drives the point home. It's like you can have the same behavior, like a white woman acting outside of, expected norms, and it can be interpreted so differently because of race.
And it all comes back to that implicit bias, right? How those unconscious judgments are shaping our perceptions without us even realizing it.
It's wild how much of this stuff is happening below the surface.
Right. It's not just about individual bad actions. It's about the systems, those invisible systems that are driving all of it. And I think this video, she does a great job of shining a light on those systems and challenging people to think about their own role in it.
And she gives such concrete examples, too, like the stairs at Tiffany's, the neighborhood watch signs, black tourists getting questioned, in random places.
Right. And it just goes to show you that monitoring spirits, they're not limited to just one space or one situation. These, these power dynamics, these ingrained prejudices, they can really manifest anywhere.
Yeah. So it's a pretty powerful reminder that these issues, they have real consequences. But she doesn't leave you just wallowing in despair. She ends with this call to action. She offers ways that we can all try to dismantle these systems.
And that's what we're going to explore in part 3. How do we go beyond awareness to actually doing something? What can we do, both individually and together, to challenge these biases and create a more just and equitable world?
Welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah.
So we've spent the last 2 parts really unpacking this concept of monitoring spirits. We've seen how it plays out, especially in the experiences of Black women. And now in this final part, I want to dig into, what Gracie says about what we can do about all of this. Like, where's the hope for change?
Yeah, it's interesting because she doesn't really offer like a quick fix.
Right.
She's not saying do this one thing and racism will magically disappear.
Yeah.
Instead, it's really about a shift in like awareness and mindset, like a fundamental change.
So it's not just about like checking things off a list,
Right.
but like a real transformation.
Exactly. And she's very clear about the fact that we can't just like, sweep microaggressions under the rug.
Right.
Or pretend they don't matter. She really believes that silence is a form of complicity.
Yeah.
So we actually have a responsibility to like speak up and challenge those behaviors when we see them happening.
And that means like acknowledging that even those, seemingly small actions,
Yeah.
they can have a big impact
Absolutely.
on that whole climate of inclusion and equality.
Exactly.
It goes back to that, that cumulative effect we were talking about earlier. Like, it all builds up.
It really does. And she takes it a step further, too.
Right.
She says it's not enough to just be, quote unquote, not racist.
Right.
It's about being actively anti-racist.
Which is,
And that takes work. It takes constant self-reflection and a willingness to like face some really uncomfortable truths, about ourselves and the systems that we're a part of.
so it's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly.
I'm curious about like what that looks like in a practical sense. Like, what does she actually suggest people do?
Well, she encourages a multi-pronged approach, which I think is smart. First, there's self-education.
Okay.
So it's about, actually taking the time to learn about the history and like the ongoing realities of racism, reading books, watching documentaries,
Yeah.
listening to podcasts like this one.
Exactly.
It's about actively seeking out like different perspectives, challenging our own, often limited understanding of these issues.
Yeah, we have to be willing to learn and grow, basically.
Totally. And she also talks about the importance of supporting organizations and initiatives that are already doing the work.
So like donating to a cause.
Yeah, donating, volunteering your time, even just like, amplifying their message on social media.
So using our platforms, our resources,
Yeah.
our voices to like create that ripple effect.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's so important to remember that we're not alone in this, There are so many people, so many groups that are already doing incredible things. And it's really about like finding those points of connection and lending our support.
It's a team effort.
It is.
Listening to Gracie, her message is definitely, it's a challenge, but I also feel like there's this sense of hope.
Oh, definitely.
Like she really believes in the power of collective action, that we
Yeah.
can actually create a better world if we work together.
Yeah, she doesn't paint a hopeless picture. She really sees that potential for transformation. But it requires us to actually like move beyond just awareness. It's got to be about action. We have to be active participants in dismantling these systems.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, is there like one question that you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah.
Like, what's the main takeaway that you hope they'll carry with them?
I think the most important question to ask yourself is, how is this concept of monitoring spirits playing out in your life? And I don't just mean the obvious examples. I mean those like subtle dynamics that we might be missing.
It's about paying attention, right?
Yeah.
Being more aware of what's happening around us.
Yeah. Yeah. Like who feels comfortable in this space? Who feels judged or unwelcome? And how can we contribute to creating an environment where everybody feels like they belong?
It's about looking for those subtle cues, challenging our own assumptions, and then, using our voices to advocate for change.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into monitoring spirits. We hope this conversation has given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to, take some action. Remember, even small steps can make a big difference. Thanks for joining us.